welcome to Rising. I'm Jessica Burbank, and I'm here with the one and only Amber Duke, here to bring you Rising Fridays together from the Rising studio here in Washington, D.C. Good morning, Amber.
Good morning. So excited to be in person. It's great.
In person, in real life, in the flesh.
Real life.
Tell us what's going on.
Absolutely. Speaker Mike Johnson's standalone Israel funding package is dead on arrival after passing the House last night. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer called the bill a joke and pledged to kill the measure before it can make it to President Biden's desk. Now, President Biden also pledged to veto the $14 billion package on the grounds it politicized the war in the Middle East and that it wasn't enough for Israel. Vice President Harris defended that posture earlier this week. Let's hear what she had to say.
The White House has said it will veto any bill that doesn't include both Israel and Ukraine. House Speaker Mike Johnson has said that he wants to do Israel first alone and then move on to Ukraine and the U.S. border. What is the path forward there, and is there room for the White House to negotiate on U.S. border immigration issues in that package?
Well, first of all, we're not negotiating that, and we've been very clear that we must stand by the role of the United States as it relates to our global responsibility to uphold and defend international rules and norms and what is right. And so our proposal is that there be aid given to both places, to Israel and to Ukraine. And we are standing by that, as you have said. The President has been very clear. If any bifurcation of that should occur, he will veto the bill that you have referred to. But let's also be clear that these folks who want to be considered as leaders in the midst of global crises of a proportion we have not seen in a very long time are playing political games with people.
Now, Punchbowl News caught up with Speaker Johnson this morning. He offered no comment on what he'll push for in Congress's next government funding measure as it relates to cuts. Today is November 3rd, and funding expires on November 17th. So it sounds like if I was Mike Johnson, I would have known very well that the Democrats would never go for the IRS cuts. It seems very obvious that they push this through knowing that. To have someone who's very pro-Israel, someone like Chuck Schumer, immediately dismissing the bill, I mean, I don't know if they're going to be able to get something pushed through before the 17th.
Yeah, it's going to be hard. And there's also disagreement within the Republican Party, too, on this, because Mitch McConnell is in favor of passing a continuing resolution that would fund the government probably through January or April. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't want to split up funding into all of these different line item packages, which is what Mike Johnson wants to do. He's more of a fiscal conservative when it comes to government spending than Mitch McConnell. So they're in a disagreement on that. They're in disagreement on the decoupling of the Israel and Ukraine aid package. If it were up to Mitch McConnell, he would be pushing through what President Biden wants, which is those two things together and a lot more aid than what was passed in this latest bill. But Mike Johnson has made it clear that he is fine with, I guess, not being in cahoots with the Senate and not being in cahoots with Mitch McConnell. He's going to do his own thing, which I think is respectable. But there is also the question of what you're actually going to get done legislatively. And right now they're at a roadblock. So we'll see what happens here. I didn't mind the IRS cuts. I don't like the IRS, so I was kind of excited about it. But it's one of those things where they have Congress people do this all the time, where they will pass legislation that they know isn't going to get through the other chamber for the sake of making a point. And then they fundraise off of it and they turn it into advertisement campaigns and all of this other nonsense. And in the meantime, we're rapidly approaching this November 17th potential shutdown.
Yeah, Mike Johnson can say, you know, look how great I'm doing as Speaker. It was all a mess before I came in, and now we have this bill that passed the House very easily. It wasn't a lot of back and forth, but how good is a bill that's never going to pass in the Senate? I think that's the big thing here. How effective is a legislator if they're pushing through bills to the upper house and they're just going to reject them and send them back? I can understand Mike Johnson wanting to keep good on the promises he made to get elected as Speaker, which I'm sure he did. But I think knowing Mitch McConnell is not going to want to go for lumping together all of the spending, I really appreciate Matt Gaetz's perspective, pushing through piecemealing all of this stuff, because I think that American people can more easily understand what the budget is if we talk about it separately. Now we're having a conversation about $14.3 billion going to Israel, where that money is coming from. That's not something that happens every budget cycle. When everything gets lumped together and passed through Congress, you don't have the same kind of focus on issues like we do here. And I think it's interesting also now that we get to see who is in support of funding for Israel, who is in support of funding for Ukraine, which I think is an important distinction right now, because a lot of the folks that supported, cuts to the Ukraine funding, they said, why are we funding this forever war? We're never going to be able to get out of it. We shouldn't be funding a war in another country. We should focus on things back home. They have to explain why that's not the case for Israel, and I think that puts a lot of members of Congress in a tough position.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and it's a debate that is really spilling out into the open in the Republican Party, even on the presidential stage, because you have Vivek Ramaswamy, who has been critical of aid to Israel even before the October 7th attack from Hamas, and he has been pretty roundly criticized by the rest of the field for that. And Nikki Haley has been rising in the polls by taking a more neoconservative approach in terms of how much involvement she wants the U.S. to have militarily abroad, and particularly in the Middle East. And for me, it's kind of disheartening, because I felt like when Trump won in 2016 that the Republican Party was clearly more interested in taking a more isolationist approach to foreign policy. They weren't interested in funding forever wars. They weren't interested in putting troops on the ground in conflicts that the U.S. frankly has nothing to do with. And then to see that Nikki Haley is performing well because foreign policy is now top of mind for Americans, it's like, whoa, where did this come from? Is there still a neoconservative wing of the Republican Party that exercises a good amount of power? And it seems like there is, and that's really unfortunate. So I agree 100%. To see Speaker Johnson pull these two packages apart is really important for getting people on the record to see where they stand on these issues. And then on the piecemeal line item spending packages as well, one of the other reasons why these massive boondoggle spending bills are such a problem is that members of Congress use it as their personal piggy bank, because they get so big and there's always things in there that people don't want to vote for, but they feel obligated because it's all lumped into this one package. In return, they ask for kickbacks to their district, or they ask for special funding for projects that they probably make money off of because they have investments in these businesses. And it just turns into this pork barrel nonsense where all of these members are getting their cut of the pie while the American people suffer.
Yeah, I think I'm disappointed, because I would imagine our progressive members of Congress, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the likes, to look at these bills and say, okay, I'll vote for this, but you have to give us a little bit of this here. And now we're really seeing Bernie Sanders fully supports aid to Ukraine. He went from being someone who's extremely anti-interventionist to someone saying the U.S. needs to be involved in this war that I don't think we have any business being involved in. And now with Israel, he was someone who was always very critical of the United States relationship with Israel, very critical of the Netanyahu government. And now to see him kind of flip on this is shocking. And he can kind of hide behind, well, this isn't what the leadership wants to do. Chuck Schumer is already saying this bill is out. We have to have funding, for Israel without cutting the IRS funding, which apparently, according to certain estimates, is going to cost them more than they'll cut. And I think it's good that the IRS is focusing on getting some of the money that's owed from the wealthiest members of our society. And I think there's been a lot of fear-mongering that it's going to affect working and middle-class families more. I think it's good we're getting that money from the wealthiest people in our society, but I don't think it's good that now we're like, okay, we have to find this money somewhere else. It should just be like, guess what? It seems like we can't afford to give this money away. And Senator Sanders and the progressives, I would expect to be the ones that were having that fight behind the scenes. But now we get to see in broad daylight that they probably were never having that fight. They were probably good with this funding all along.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see what happens more generally with the Democratic Party on this issue, because you did have 12 Democrats who voted in the House to move this Israel package through over to the Senate. And then Joe Biden kind of finds himself in a difficult place, too, because he's been hemorrhaging support from the progressive base of the party, which is generally pro-Palestine. And he's been very aggressively pro-Israel. And at the same time, though, it's like trying to pay lip service to the pro-Palestinian contingent of the party. And so I'm not sure how he's able to really thread that needle.
Yeah, I think it's crazy that you have coming from the White House the discussion about the $14 billion package, that you have Kamala Harris running game with the press, the discussion that it's politicized, the discussion that it wasn't enough money. That's insane.
Right.
In total, since the founding of Israel, the United States government has given them $158 billion to give them $14 billion in a year to strengthen an Iron Dome that they already have and is functioning, and clearly dysfunctioned on the day of October 7th, whether deliberately or not. And then to give them an Iron Beam as well. It's like, if the United States seriously wanted peace in the region, if they really wanted a two-state solution, like many of them say, I think a lot of people recognize that a two-state solution is pretty outdated in the region. But for them to invest that much money in the Israeli military that's committed so many atrocities, you have so many protesters calling for a ceasefire, and you have people saying that this isn't enough money. That is insane to me when they're trying to find the dollars, and the first thing that will go is money to young mothers and children if we face a government shutdown. Over what? Over giving more money to a state that's committing war crimes? It just doesn't sit right with me.
I think it's way too much money. And in general, what I've always said in regards to Israel is our allyship doesn't mean that we should be sort of single-handedly financing their existence. And the U.S. has been doing that for a long time. And we have enough issues here at home domestically with our homeless crisis, rising crime in cities, the border crisis. To view this as our priority right now, I think is really offensive to the very many Americans who are struggling. And this should not be the priority for what we're spending our taxpayer money on. All right, we're going to have to leave it there, and we'll be back with more Rising after this.